for starting. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We've got a really good turnout. I've convinced myself I've got the best voluntary job in the world, which is speaker organizer for the Labour Housing Group. So all of the kind of most interesting people who've got things to say about housing, I can invite along to talk about relevant topics to us. I'm delighted tonight that we've got Tom Archer, who's Senior Research Fellow. It's a bit of a mouthful, for the Centre of Regional Economic and Social Research at my old university, Sheffield Hallam University. And the key challenge that Tom's going to talk to us about, it's obviously the challenge for hopefully an incoming Labour government, is how we build 1.5 million homes, which seems likely to be a manifesto commitment. It's a series of two talks. So Tom tonight is going to focus on the construction industry, and then in August we've got an expert called Beth Stratford who's going to talk to us about land availability. So if I play you in, Tom, so we need to build 1.5 million homes. We've got the construction industry in the state it's in, and I know you've kind of done intensive research and you've got some strong opinions on that. So do you want to share those with us?
Yeah, I mean, where to start? I think maybe some historical context is quite a good one. I mean, like you say, there's whoever comes in actually looking at the various kind of policy documents that are informing the different manifestos of different parties, they're going to set big targets for house building. Some of them might set specific targets for affordable housing, some might not. But either way, there's going to be big targets. And Labour obviously have this target of 1.5 million, which is 300,000 homes a year per year of the next Parliament. So to give that a flavour of the scale of that task, we haven't added that many new homes since about the late 1970s. And we haven't actually added more than 250,000 a year for 2 decades. So this is a really, really big target. And some people argue it's a kind of relatively blunt one. I mean, targets around what we build, where we build them, maybe the kind of sub-target, or should be the sub-target. But, this is a huge number. And at the minute, we're not getting very close to that number. So something really quite radical is needed to get us there. I think a lot of the things we've been saying about this subject is about the current state of the house building industry and whether it can kind of deliver those types of numbers. Because I think an incoming Labour government will face a bit of a dilemma: either use the current system and the current volume house builders to build out the majority of these homes, or to try to fundamentally change the structure of the industry, which may run counter to kind of achieving the target. So there's a bit of a kind of tension, I think, and we don't really talk about that. I mean, one thing that I don't think we're talking about enough is how important it is to have a diversity of builders, because the industry has changed really, really radically over a period of time. So in the 1980s, we had 10,000 small builders building nearly 60% of all our homes. By 2014, that had dropped to about 3,000 small builders building 20-odd% of our homes. So the kind of small builders are kind of disappearing at a relatively rapid rate. And the volume house builders, the big house builders, have accounted for more and more market share over time. So the report we did late last year suggested that about the biggest 8 house builders build about 45% of all our homes. So now should be at pains to say that whilst that isn't ideal, there are industries where there are small companies that have huge market share. So like the mining industry, the biggest 10 firms control 70% of the market. So this isn't the least competitive market. that we have in our economy, but it's certainly not the most competitive. So we've got these problems, and I think with housing, there's an important dimension to this. On the one hand, you've got 8 house builders who control a lot of supply, and they also have a lot of the planning permissions as well. It's important to say that there's some research that suggests that they have a lot of the planning, in terms of the proportion of planning permissions for development, they have a really large proportion of those. But there's another dimension to this, which is about the political economy of housing. So it's such a live and important political issue that if you're one of those 8 companies that contributes to nearly half of all supply, then you can really start to say, well, look, this is what we need in terms of policy. This is what we need in terms of a planning environment, and it's that effect on how we think about future supply that I think is really important. It's that kind of political aspect. There's some good work by some academics for an organisation called CASH, which kind of looks at some of those issues. But in terms of diversity, if we just want to simplify it and say, why is it so important that we have a diversity of builders? Well, we won't get the houses we need at the speed we need them if we don't have diversity. So there was a report earlier this year by the Competitions and Markets Authority that says the level of diversity of housing types on a site affects how quickly they're built out. So if you have a small number of builders building relatively similar types of homes, similar tenures, no affordable housing or limited affordable housing, then they will be slower to build out, which means we get housing at a slower rate. We're not going to be able to develop them at the speed we need to. And then there's the other point about diversity, which is about affordability. So, if we're just building private homes and we're not focusing on affordability, then that's going to affect how quickly we build as well. Because a house builder can build affordable housing and sell them as a block, and it doesn't affect their release of private housing, which is going to a separate market. So the provision of affordable housing, particularly on large sites, is really important. But I think maybe, Andy, we can touch on in a minute the changes that have happened financially with these house builders, which is the thing that we should be paying some attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to start with the volume house builders in a dominant position, and as a Labour government, we're going to be very dependent on the volume house builders. What can we do to kind of cajole them to work in an effective and ethical way?
Yeah, that's the question I often get asked, and it's a very, very difficult question. I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is really understand what is happening and what has happened in that sector, because we can't make policy unless we start to accept that something fundamental has changed. And what has really changed is that, years and years ago, these used to be family firms, and then they were owned by pension funds. But now, actually, the largest shareholders in our volume house builders are kind of global asset managers. So we've got US-based asset managers, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. These are the people that own the biggest shares in our house builders. And so what happens is, if they generate lots of profit and they start to pay dividends, and I'm going to talk about changes in some of this stuff in a minute, that flows out of our housing market. It basically doesn't get reinvested in building more homes. And if what you have is a model where more and more is being extracted in that way, you get less and less being put back into house building. And it's, in policy terms, it's how do we deal with that? How do we really make sure that the surpluses that get generated through house building get put back in to build more homes and affordable homes? And it's the mechanisms by which you do that, which I think are really tricky, but we can maybe talk about that a little bit.
So I think that's the critical question, Tom. How you tax these profits. So I'm assuming you've given thought to this.
Yeah, I think there's various things that I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think, unless you are being really radical and like bringing these into state ownership, you're going to be able to completely address this. But I do think there are some key things you can do. And I think the US is quite instructive, really, in what they've done over recent years. So they've started conditioning public funding on the basis that you're not going to be paying dividends at 40% of profit. You're going to get public support, on the basis that you put that money back in and you reinvest it. So the US Inflation Reduction Act has specific measures on dividends and buybacks, share buybacks, which is another big emerging issue about how value is extracted. So there are key policy things we can do. I think land is also a big part of this, and interesting that you've got Beth speaking to you next time. Yeah. One of Labour's big plans, I would say, in the policy forum documents is around how do you get the state active in acquiring and bringing land forward, particularly for large sites and new settlements, in order for the state to get that uplift in value of land. So getting that land at kind of low agricultural value, getting it permissioned for housing, so it massively increases in value, could be 70 to 100 times more valuable with permission. And then it's secured that value, and it can use that how it wants, either to build more affordable homes or whatever. And in places like Germany and in Europe, that is just standard practice. The state is very active in acquiring and bringing land forward for development. There's an example of a city in Germany I was reading about recently called Ulm, and over 100 years they've essentially acquired lots and lots of land to the point where they own a third of all land in their municipality. And they're releasing that for the specific types of housing that they think are needed in the specific parts of their areas. So, I think this is just more common, and I think this is Labour has cottoned onto this, and they see that as a big part of the picture. So if you're much more active in the land market, you're forcing the developers to be construction companies rather than land speculators. And I think there's a route to solving some of those issues that way.
I saw a question pop up in the chat from Peter, and it's a good one, and it's around the capacity of the volume house builder. So obviously we've been reading lots of stuff about supply. We've been reading lots of stuff about labour. Do the volume house builders have the capacity?
It's a good. Do they have the capacity to build more? I would say yes. But the key thing that constrains the development, and various studies have mentioned this, is it's about actually maintaining prices. So you can only release houses for sale at the rate that the market can absorb them. Because if you release them too quickly, then you're gonna get a lower price. So there's a dynamic about how quickly things get released, depending on what the market is willing to absorb. So in some ways, this is a capacity issue, but it's actually more about the maintenance of prices and kind of some of those factors that house builders look at in terms of the release of new homes.
So it's interesting, as you were saying that Sarah Hart was making the same point in the chat. So the big problem of land banking, how do we deal with this?
Yeah, how do we deal with that? Well, part of the problem is we've embedded the problem over decades. So we've essentially created a system where house builders are very active in land markets, and that's a key part of the profit margin, essentially, how they and for certain house builders, one of the things we found in some recent research that has been noted by other researchers is that some of the big houses are paying less for land now than they were 10 years ago. So when you think about house price inflation, you would expect them to be paying significantly more for land now than they were a decade ago, but some of them are actually paying less, which is a remarkable business success. Yeah. I think they'd really celebrate that. But it has an effect on pricing, because it essentially means that the margin per home can be extended. The price doesn't come down, the margin of profit increases, and we noted in previous reports that the strategy has often been to prioritize margin over volume. So actually to make more profit by increasing the amount you get per home, rather than trying to increase the total amount that you build to get more profit that way. So kind of focus on margin over volume, and that's their words, not just mine.
Yeah. Can we talk about diversity? So if we can talk about small builders or smaller builders before we talk about community land trust and other kind of community activity. So is this just capitalism? Is this just kind of us moving towards oligarchy? Or is there something that can be done about it? So I know this government's got a relatively small fund to try and encourage the medium-sized builders. So is this kind of concentration inevitably where we're going, or could a Labour government try and change this?
Well, I guess there's two views on that. One is this is happening in a lot of our key industries. So if you think about water, energy, some of these are actually regulated monopolies. So water is one of those. House building is different. You know, and what we tend to find is that as ownership changes, dividends get ramped up, it becomes more and more extractive, and we, the kind of consumer, are paying more in our bills. And and I think in some ways that is what's happening in house building because of who now owns the biggest shareholdings in some of these firms. But so on the one hand, this is a broad pattern. On the other hand, we can look at other European countries and say, well, hang on a minute, we are fundamentally different. Our house building industry is fundamentally different. In a place like Germany, over 50% of their homes are self-built, self-commissioned homes. So this is individual households, families that get hold of a piece of land and then commission a builder to build their house on that land. So that's more than half of all units developed each year are developed through that route. And it's essentially non-speculative. You know, those households are not kind of building in profit margins, and they're not looking at it like that. And if you look at the same subsector in the UK, it only builds 7%. So that's one of the biggest differentiators between us and other European countries. We've got a tiny self-build sector, and that's something that we can work on and we can grow without a huge amount of public subsidy. We have a lot of legislation that's been put through to make sure that local authorities provide an adequate number of plots to meet local demand for self-build. And yet that's not really working as it should. So kind of tweaks to existing legislation is that part of the house building industry can grow without a huge amount of kind of grant subsidy, which I think is a really interesting thing for Labour. I don't know whether they're talking about this. I don't know how central it is to some of their policy ideas, but it is an area that should be looked at. But yeah, that so on the one hand, I guess you would say this feels a bit inevitable across all industries. But on the other hand, we can look across the channel and say, well, other countries do this very differently. And there is nowhere near as much kind of speculation on land and things like that in some of these countries. So maybe that gives us hope that there are models that can be applied from, and lessons that can be applied from our European peers.
So, Tom, early on you mentioned affordability. So there is going to be a tension between building for sale and also building affordable, and particularly building council homes. And we all remember the Attlee government that actually kind of introduced legislate or restrictions to kind of direct resources towards council housing. How would a Labour government try and protect the building of affordable housing and also just make sure it doesn't kind of get squeezed out in the rush for land, material and labour?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in the kind of down cycle of the house building, in the down of the house building cycle as we are now, the argument is this is the time when we should build in the maximum amount of affordable. This is where the opportunities are to get land cheaper and to build on some of those sites. And I don't think we've really seized that. Now, whether a new Labour government would seize that, I think that would be interesting. I don't think we can run away from the issue of sufficient grant to build. And that poses some really tough questions for the Labour's fiscal rules. And some of you will be really better versed on that than I am. But how far are we willing to go? Are we willing to borrow to invest in housing because it is of such critical social importance? I think these are big questions for Labour. In terms of council house building, I think there's a capacity within local authorities. I think the issue here is about building capacity within local authorities to do some of this again, especially if you're talking about like direct labour organisations actually building. How likely that is to grow, I don't know, but it's certainly a significant loss of that capacity over the decades. So, but I guess, if Labour's pushing for public bodies, development corporations to be much more active in land assembly and acquisition and assembly, then it's a natural next step for them to be more involved in the development process as well, and to be able to control the types and tenures of homes that get built on some of those sites.
I know you've done lots of great work on community land trust, cooperative housing. Do you want to talk about the role of those organisations?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the diversity picture, really. I think we need to mobilise as many parts of the kind of house building system or housing supply system as we possibly can. And a kind of critical bit of that is around self-build, and it's about community-led housing. And I think one of the things that is probably not as well known as it should be are the kind of impacts that you get from community-led housing, particularly in terms of affordability. So we did a study last year which we were trying to assess whether community-led homes are genuinely affordable. So we weren't interested in like price to income ratios. We were trying to work out for the people that live in those homes, how much is their housing costs as a proportion of their income, and is it less than 35% as it should be? And some of those homes are kind of remarkably affordable, competitive with and sometimes outperforming the kind of housing association sector. There are models in London which are actually models about discounted sale, where properties were being sold with resale covenants for kind of 60% of their market price, and you can't achieve those kinds of affordabilities unless you are hugely value driven, if you're all about maximizing affordability. And some of these organizations, it's their top priority to create, and particularly in high value rural areas as well, can we create really affordable homes in these places which price out anything but the highest income earners, really. So community-led housing has thrived in some of the most difficult markets, and it's used a lot of tools to make sure that affordability can be preserved. And in the research we did last year, there's a really interesting case study in Cambridgeshire, another high value market, where the CLT works with landowners, but within a planning context where there is a dedicated kind of planning policy for community-led housing. And they're able to kind of get land at much cheaper costs because they're rural exception sites. And then they sell off part of that site, and what the proceeds of that help fund the construction costs. So this is an area called Streatham and Wilburton CLT. And some of those models are really interesting because, again, they're relatively low on grant requirements. So there will be areas where you need a significant amount of grants to deliver affordable homes, but there are community-led schemes that don't, and these are all part of the mix. I think the current government has tried to increase community-led housing, but the stop-start nature of its funding has really hampered the development of that sector. It'll be interesting to see where Labour go next with this, and whether they're willing to commit long-term to seeing the growth of things like self-build and community-led and cooperative housing. So yeah, I think this is an important subsector that we should all be looking to see whether it can grow.
So, Tom, the questions and comments are piling up in the chat. So
I can't keep an eye on two things. Sorry, Andy.
No, fine. So I'm going to ask you to address that. So that's telling me I need to be quiet and give other people a chance. But final question, Tom. Top 2 or 3 legislative changes an incoming Labour government should make?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think there are tweaks to the existing legislation on self-build that we should be looking at, and thinking about how do we get more self-build on small sites and also as a percentage of larger sites. Similarly, with community-led housing, can we ensure that a percentage of these sites is available for these groups. In terms of legislation for the volume house builders, I think this is a bigger macroeconomic question about how much are we willing to let companies extract from our economy before they reinvest for the things that we need. And I think some of this can be addressed by much broader economic policies around tax and spend, essentially. And that's going to cover water, energy, housing, the key things that people need to live.
I mean, in terms of the big macro question, can I publicise Bob Cornett's brilliant book, The Property Lobby? In fact, Bob's on the call today. Okay, so I promised I'd shut up. Tom, do you want to take a look at the chat and respond to the kind of tens of questions and comments that have come through?
Yeah. Point me to any that you think.
Okay.
Try to do them.
So we've got 25. If you want to work your way down the list.
Yeah. Okay. So shall I start with?
Yeah, please.
There might be one above. Hang on a minute.
And then I'll throw it open for people to.
Yeah, the point. I mean, we touched on a little bit earlier about can they increase their capacity. So this is the starkest way I can put it. So if you compare 2005 and 2022, the difference in terms of how many houses were built, they built 23% more homes in 2022 than they did in 2005. Their dividends were 260% bigger in 2022 than 2005, and their profits were 60-70% bigger. So the capacity is there to grow, but there is a kind of a much bigger imperative, I think, for these organisations, which is about returning value to shareholders, and that is what is a key factor. I mean, for the house builders, they will say the planning system is the big constraint in how much they can build, and there is some validity to some of those arguments, but the kind of business model for me is a kind of crucial part of whether they build more. The point on volume house builders will not flood the market because they control the market. I think there's a degree of truth in that. The Competition Markets Authority were pretty clear that they don't think that there's competition issues in this market. They think there was an issue with information sharing between the biggest house builders, but they think it's a relatively competitive market, and that's partly because of the metrics that they use to calculate that. I think what is probably being missed is the profits and the increase in profits, particularly since the global financial crisis, shows that this is not a cyclical industry, really. You've got supernormal profits for a large part of the last 13, 14 years. That's not an industry that's cyclical as far as we're concerned. So yeah, I think, whether this is a competitive market. And then there's the question about competition at local levels as well, because a lot of house builders will hold land at a local level, and there's not a huge amount of land supply in that area. So when it comes to kind of controlling markets, we can think about this in local terms, or we can think about this nationally as in terms of market share. So so the next one, so which offers direct competition to larger house builders? Yeah, so basically, I think the person here is suggesting that there's not much in the policy documents about how smaller builders, individuals, can compete with house builders. Is that right? Jump in if you. Is that Simon?
Yeah. I mean, I've experienced large scale house delivering in Australia in the 2000s, and certainly they're way behind the UK on MMC in general. However, house building, they are streets ahead of us on in kit building or self-building that uses a kit, whatever you want to describe it as. And the reason for that is because they have the land to make these developments user-friendly. Utilities and infra all put in by municipalities, nice big plots of land or plots of land that you've got that you can easily do a subdivision in an area that's zoned as residential. no high risk sites fraught with problems that small investors have to deal with. It's on a plate, and you can get yourself some real decent sized homes for what you live in the UK like, and what they can build for the same price over there. We're really missing a trick by not pushing this initial legislation where local authorities have to maintain a list, etc. You agree, it's not really working very well. However, if this is reinvigorated by development corporations, master plan developments, this invigorating the local kit building industry, bringing in some outside players, this could be transformational if it gives a kick up the backside to the cartel of house builders, and gives some direct competition.
I think that's a really good point. I'd agree with a lot of that. I mean, I think it makes me think about Germany, where if you're a self-builder and you want to find someone to build your home, there's a website with 350 contractors on, all of which have specific styles, and you are commissioning through this incredibly competitive market. That feels quite different to how it works here. And there is a kind of infrastructure to go in around self-build and kit-built homes. There's a need to kind of develop that market, I think, if it's going to take off. But yeah, at the minute, I think you'd say that the actual plots for people to build on are not coming through at the rate that we would want them to. The next question from Pieter about cost management. I can read these, or you're welcome to jump in if you want to just fire your question at me. So I think this point is really about the impact of cladding remediation on the capacity to build more. I mean, I think we see in the financial accounts, because a lot of our analysis is of financial accounts of volume house builders, that really substantial amounts of money are being put aside.
Diana Gardner, could I ask you just to go on mute, please? Diana? Okay, thanks. Yeah, sorry, Tom.
Yeah, so really large amounts are being set aside to deal with those kind of cladding issues. In fact, there's adjustments in the accounts to show profit, excluding those that money that's being set aside. So the profit, actually, there's two profit lines, if you like. One with the cladding taken out, and the other with it left in. But there is still a significant amount of profit after those adjustments, and there is a really significant increase in the amount of dividends that are paid from what's left. So in 2005, about 16% of profits were paid in dividends. In 2022, it was 47% of profit was paid out in dividends. So there is this sum, which is this value that's extracted that could be put to building more homes. Now, house builders may say the funds is not the issue, it's the land, but then we would look at kind of the amount of permissioned land and say you could still be building faster than you are. So yeah, I think there's part of this might be capacity, but some of it is the choices about use of surpluses.
So I feel sorry for you, Tom. The questions are coming in quicker than you can answer them. But
I know.
It's been a thought-provoking talk. So yeah, if you want to keep working your way through.
Yeah. So where did we get up to? We got up to, and I'm not doing them as quickly as in order to get to the end. So yeah. I mean, there's a question here about York and about agricultural prices, and about land values and the cost of building a new home. I think there's points we've mentioned earlier about the cost base for the volume house builders is they've actually been quite successful, some of them, in reducing their land costs. So the actual inflation in the prices, which has been quite significant over recent years, is a big part of that is margins and inflation in material and labour costs. Someone asked a question here about mixing kind of mutualized municipal house builders as a way perhaps to achieve diversity. And I think that's a good point. I think in London, obviously, some of you present have worked on community-led schemes with councils. And I think the community-led housing sector and the CLT network, who represents CLTs nationally, have really been pushing for these kind of partnerships between housing associations, local councils, to build more community-led homes. And I think the crucial role for a local authority might not only be in the development end, but also in the policy and planning end, and about making sure that there is a policy environment for community-led housing which is conducive. So some of the things that have happened in that sector over recent years is site disposals just for community-led housing groups. So these are plots of land that only community-led housing groups can bid for. That was an approach taken in Bristol, and there's some good lessons from that, I think. Martin uses the term oligarchy, which we've used before and maybe been told off for using. I think the truth is this is not the least competitive market that we have, but it's certainly not as competitive as we want it to be, and not as competitive historically as it was. And what we've seen is a real kind of diminishing role for small to medium builders. So in policy terms, the question is, how do we address that? How do we make sure that public funding programs really support that sector so that it can grow?
Oh, sorry, Diana, we need you to go on mute. We can hear you typing your question. Okay, keep going, Tom.
So there's a question here about shifting to capital subsidy to sustain proper social rents. And I think that's a really good point. I mean, there's an argument here about state investment and how we classify it and how we justify it on the basis of the returns that we get. And there's been some really excellent studies over recent years about if you invest in social rented homes, you're not only creating the housing that's affordable to people on lower incomes, but you're getting this kind of wealth of economic impacts as well. And shifting from capital subsidy to subsidy through the welfare system is a key argument. I don't think the current government has taken that up. I don't think that's really been processed. But maybe future governments may pick that up a bit more. So housing associations have far too much debt on their balance sheet, given the lack of grant funding. What is your view on institutional capital, pension funds, is being attracted to the affordable housing sector? I think the nature of finance has to be allied with changes in how the developers and who owns the developers and who controls them. Because I think one without the other kind of creates some issues. So we may well want to bring in institutional finance, but it's important that the residents and tenants who are the beneficiaries of those homes also have some control over those organisations. Because I think what we see in the housing association sector is a financialisation process where they're engaged in more and more sophisticated financial processes and maybe further and further away from tenants. So I think there's an issue around ownership and control, as well as the nature of the finance that gets provided. One of the things that I've argued for in recent papers is we think about citizen finance as much as we do about institutional finance. So can we create systems where we as individuals can pay in to funds which support affordable housing and kind of democratize the finance for housing rather than rely on institutional and global asset managers? So there's a question there for future governments.
Tom, can we just pause? So I don't know if housing associations have been your area of research, but obviously an incoming Labour government's going to be highly dependent on particularly the big housing associations to deliver affordable homes. Are they burdened with debt, or have they got surpluses which are still to be released?
Well, I'm not sure of I don't have the figures on total debt. I suspect I suspect there's something in it that these organisations have taken on more debt than historically was the case. But then there's also the kind of immersion into that world of finance, so that they're now subject to things like credit rating agencies. They're now subject to kind of debt coverage requirements, and all of these affect how decisions can be made and who they're made for. And I think that's really the concern, that kind of broader, not just debt, but broader kind of financialization, really. There's a problem here about sticking with the current funding for the Tories' affordable homes programme. One of the things I've been very surprised about is the scale of the rhetoric from Labour around affordable housing, with the lack of any clear signal of how that funding will change and whether it will increase. I don't think that's something that they can stay quiet on for long. I think there has to be a view on whether they're going to increase affordable housing grants if they're putting so much emphasis on making sure that affordable supply comes through. I don't think that can be ducked for too long.
So Tom, it can't be ducked for too long. But any idea how much we're talking about? An extra 7 billion? What would you say?
Well, I guess how do you engineer that figure? If you were to start with 300,000 homes that you're going to build, and you're also going to say, well, what is the backlog of housing needs? So there's a chap called Glenn Bramley who's done some brilliant work calculating the kind of backlog of homes that we need to build. If we're going to build at that scale, and interestingly, the Liberal Democrats are committing, or have done in some of their conference proposals, to 150 affordable homes per year. If you're going to start kind of committing to those, you're going to be talking additional billions. Certainly additional billions. But I think, that this is not my specific area. And what I would say is that there is surpluses in the broader housing system that can fund some of this. So if you look at the Affordable Homes Programme 16 to 21, about 9 billion was spent over that period. If you look at the dividends of our biggest house builders over the same period, 2016 to 2021, they paid out 11 billion in dividends. So 8 companies' dividends amounted to more than our whole government's programme on affordable housing. And it tells you a little bit about where the power and the surpluses are in our kind of housing supply system. There's an example here of a CLT from our council, purchased a plot to build 19 homes, £300,000 total purchase price, which affects the affordability pledges. Other CLTs have paid £1 for the same plot of land from the council. Yeah, and I think for the community-led housing sector, this issue around land costs is absolutely critical. In the studies we've done of the affordability of community-led homes, the land component always comes out as really critical, because if you can get land at a cheaper cost and you can capture the value uplift, then you can use that to subsidise essentially the level of rent paid. So some of Labour's ideas around this is good. Looking at the Land Compensation Act, looking at CPO rules. Some of these things they'll be politically difficult, I think, but they are a route to kind of acquiring more land at existing use value, which will be key. Planning permission gives a property location right. That's what has increased the price. There should be a lower price, but how? Well, maybe that is about land compensation, CPO rules. I certainly will keep looking for more detail on how Labour are going to achieve this. This might, if they get into power. So how that works in practice. I mean, past Labour governments have tried to reform the Land Compensation Act, and it was quite quickly overturned by when the political control changed. So, how do you create a system which keeps those powers there for the long term is pretty crucial. Labour can achieve a lot by directing the deal at capital programme. As we show in the latest UK housing review, half of its capital programme goes towards supporting the private market. Much of this is underspent and could be directed towards a new affordable homes programme. I think that's an excellent point. I think that's partly the product of the way that housing associations now plan these developments. One of the interesting things from our community-led housing research, we evaluated a big grant programme, and the amount of private provision used across subsidising some of those schemes was tiny. So 80–90% of homes on a developed site was affordable, compared to significantly lower 60–70% for affordable homes programme schemes. So we're back to the kind of issue of diversity. Can you grow these bits of the supply system which maximise affordability? How will volume builders react to Labour's proposals to make common hold the default tenure for all new build? Good question. I don't know. But all I do know is that it has become, leasehold has become another mechanism for extraction, really. The scandals of a few years ago of ground rents increasing at remarkable and then being packaged up and sold off to third parties. I think, we have to keep a really close eye on the kind of systems for profit making and how value gets extracted when we want it kind of reinvested. In terms of the House Commons Select Committee, cars are incompatible with climate. Can we have new car-free housing? Yeah, good point. Some of this is obviously gets determined in the planning system, but I would certainly turn to some community-led housing schemes which have really fought hard to reduce the amount of parking spaces, because they're trying to reduce car usage on their schemes. There's the interesting study. I mean, on the broader point of carbon emissions, there's some really good research by people at UCL who said that if we built all of the supply that we say we need, it would consume all of our carbon budget up to 2048. We can't build the amount of houses that we need without very significant impacts on our carbon emissions, and we don't seem to talk about that particularly vehemently either. I think it's something that we really need to talk about. Can we supply and reduce carbon emissions at the same time? I think that's a difficult ask. Why not have lots of boxable prefabs? Did prefabs work in the past? I don't know. I would maybe question that. Self-commissioned also deliver higher quality and better energy efficiency as a rule. In our community-led housing reviews of affordability, one of the things we found is that there's quite a big difference in the energy performance of these homes, and you can actually calculate the monetary saving from those higher environmental standards, and you can think about that as money off your rent. So we kind of calculate the monetary value of some of these environmental performance benefits for the people that live in those homes who are going to pay less in energy bills and things like that. So there's a direct relationship between affordability, energy performance, and energy usage. Labour is talking about brownfield delivery, but what about areas where brownfield is thin on the ground, especially in rural parts of the country? You might correct me, but I think Labour has been relatively clear on using what they're calling the grey belts, so things that are within the green belt, but of lower quality. I mean, the issue of developing on brownfield is kind of, some of you will be more experienced than me, but a really, really difficult one. You have to be able to remediate the land before you can build on it. And I think what we have are things like infrastructure funding to put in infrastructure, and maybe a little bit of separate remediation funds. And there's an argument to say, do we need something a bit more coherent on those things? Self-build plots have gone for more than 100,000 in York. Yeah, I think self-build is not a panacea for affordable housing. In fact, the majority of self-build is not designed to be an affordable home. Some of them are, but it meets a specific bit of the market, and the diversity that's offered by building self-build, it contributes to the speed at which we can build out, and also kind of the speculative processes that are involved. So yeah, not a solution to affordable housing need, but important part of the mix, I think. The elephant in the room is right to buy legislation and homes being lost to the open market. Yeah, that is an issue, but the lack of a kind of one-for-one replacement is part of that, I think, isn't it? That we've underperformed on that for decades. I live in a flat pack house, 100% good. Read my first article on modular building in 1966. What is wrong with us? Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people across the channel, our European neighbours, who would probably think the same. You know, look at us as an anomaly in terms of how we supply housing. Any chance that cities with mainly low-rise residential housing may have many more high-rise buildings? Not too sure about that one. I'm not sure whether Labour has any plans for densification. Correct me if I've not seen that. Plots to build on cost hundreds of thousands. That's obscene, isn't it? I think the land values are reflected in house prices, and we've got the kind of process of valuing land very wrong, especially because, you know, and this dates back to thinkers from the 1700s. You don't own land, you know, it's an unearned increment when you sell it, and we all kind of are kind of stewards rather than owners. So yeah, there's a kind of particularly philosophical angle to that, as whether we can claim ownership of that land. Questions to Salma: in regard to fundamental changes, how feasible can planning laws be reformed to allow Labour to build more homes and meet the target of building 1.5 million homes in the next 5 years? It's a really good point. I think there needs to be a little bit of honesty about whether reforming the planning system can have any effect within 5 years. If we're going to build 1.5 million homes in the next Parliament, the effect of planning reforms, well, it may take years to kind of decide on those planning reforms and implement them, and then the effects of them will span out over years. Their effect in the next Parliament, my argument would be, is pretty limited. So if the reforms aren't going to do it, is it through new settlements? How quickly can you get those new settlements built out within 5 years? These are all quite difficult questions, I think. Mary: far more effective to do things quickly via policy than go down the long road of reforming planning law. Yeah, I think that speaks to the point I've just made. Do you think there is any value in Labour pursuing the use it or lose it measures to get sites out of the hands of land bankers and slow to build out? There was a point in time a few years ago where that was a really big policy idea, and the rationale for it still stands. If you've got land which is optioned, which has been held for 20 years because a developer is waiting for the right point to put permission in and then build it out, then that's, you know, that is really holding back supply. Now, whether those use it and lose it powers can be implemented without the unintended consequence of stopping supply and house builders retrenching and saying, we don't like this, so we're not going to build. These are the kind of dynamics that we have to think about when making policy, because the house builders have that power to cut off supply. So we've lots of land, 6% of the UK is built on. My challenge on that would be, but we have lots of people that don't want that land to be built on. So how do we convince them that we should build on it and we should build affordable homes? How do we do that? One of the things we've been doing recently, actually, is looking at whether community-led housing schemes receive more or less support or objection in the planning system than comparable non-community-led housing schemes. Now, that's a piece of work that's kind of at a very, very early stage, but you can see just from initial kind of data that groups generally tend to get far more public support for community-led housing than the kind of comparator schemes. So how far can that model go in driving additional supply in places where it would be resisted? that's something that we're going to be looking at over the coming months and years. In Somerset, we've seen an assault on Section 106 homes. Developers are trying to ignore the agreements or change them. Not only are they building few social homes, but many are being lost. Yeah, I guess this takes us to the point about how do you hold developers to their agreements. I guess this is tied up also with kind of assessments of viability. I don't know what policy you can make for that. I guess there's also questions around the infrastructure levy, how you kind of draw out that value in commuted sums and how you put it back in, how you get the correct amount. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one, I'm afraid, Maureen. Could anyone approach the tycoon developers? Have you heard of Lee Kar Singh? No, I haven't. I guess it's interesting that what we see with the big house builders is they've held the biggest house builders have held their position as big house builders for quite a long time, but also they're kind of merged over the years. More and more have merged. So there's one being discussed at the minute. There was a creation of Vistry last year, I think maybe two or 3 years ago, which was the combination of two of the other biggest house builders. So we see this kind of, so that suggests to me that their kind of capacity to kind of maintain their position in the market is pretty good. We don't see a lot of big new entrants, although that could happen over time. Who's going to train the skilled workers now? The CITB college has gone. Really good point. SME builders train a far higher proportion of construction workers than some bigger house builders, as far as I understand it. So, there are questions there about who's doing this. How can we share that the burden of training the next workforce? What is the use of 10-year blind target of 1.5 million? Why no target for council housing? Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there's also a kind of political dimension to this, which is it's far easier to pull levers to affect affordable housing delivery than it is to affect total housing delivery, because that private market is kind of autonomous. They're not relying on your grant largely. So if you wanted a target to hit, you would probably choose the total amount of affordable to be delivered rather than what the total supply system delivers, because that's going to be much harder to control and affect. By having government take control of the market with development corporations, create master plans, sections sold to volume house builders, this will put volume house builders in direct competition with each other on many large sites. In turn, this may change their business model, making profits via volume output, not restricting output. That's a good point. I guess my response would be: is there a danger that those house builders can basically say, no, this is what we will build at? We're not going to enter into a kind of competitive arrangement. We're going to build at what we think we can build for, what our current business models can sustain. And if you don't, if that's too much, then fine, we'll build somewhere else. So I guess thinking this through in terms of competition, it may be more complicated than that. It may not be as easy as just pitching house builders against one another. What does Labour intend to do about housing associations, gangland buy and rent, and undeclared maintenance fees? Not too sure about that one. Here in the West, this is from Eddie. Here in the West Midlands, we have worked with Birmingham City Council to create a community-led housing policy that allows for an enabling approach to planning and negotiations around land values, with further possible discounts on site through additionality. Maybe the Labour Party could certainly help by using these kinds of enabling policies. We have 8 sites that we're working with City Council on. Most of their MMC and will be owned as community land trust. So yeah, that's really interesting. We've followed some of these developments in the community-led housing sector over recent years, and there have been places which have created dedicated community-led housing strategies and policies, dedicated supplementary planning documents, dedicated processes to release publicly owned land for development to community-led housing. And these have an effect in places like Cambridgeshire and Bristol, and obviously in Birmingham. These are starting to have an effect. Do you want to come back on that, Eddie? Do you want to?
No, I'm just happy listening to you. Yeah. Which I mean, I just attended because I just wanted to see what was going on, and you know, if we can get, I think you've made the case for community-led housing fantastically well already.
Oh, it sounds like progress is being made in Birmingham, and I do know a little bit about that. But really interesting that most are going to be MMC. I think that's fascinating. At a time when MMC is
actually, I can talk about that. We've been working with Accord Housing, who have a factory in Walsall. They produce the homes locally, so there's jobs and skills outputs as well. But the really interesting thing is Birmingham City Council, despite the Section 114, their affordable housing team have worked really hard to create this policy with us. You know, working with and around the commissioners. And I mean, I've been sort of pushing this at Dudley Labour Group as well about how we do things without money. Obviously, the next Labour government is going to have that problem. And certainly in community-led housing, there's a lot can be done without money. There's a lot of enabling policies that if they, and also you mentioned earlier, the stop-start support of the government. It's been absolutely crazy. 7 or 8 housing ministers, grants created and then pulled. If Labour were just stable on that, that would be a massive, massive help.
Yeah.
And so we could provide good support and help.
Certainty of funding for that sector in particular is really crucial, I think. And international examples like Canada show that if you put in place 15 years of funding, the sector grows markedly. The Glen Bramley work I mentioned.
Oh, sorry, can I just ask John Bevan to go on mute, please? We're getting quite a lot of background, but yeah, carry on, Tom.
Thanks. Yeah, the Glen Bramley work I mentioned earlier about the kind of backlog of housing need nationally has been updated in the current UK housing review. It would be good to invite him to talk about this. I'd come if you did invite him, and it's on my reading list. It's kind of core reading for housing academics, I think, the housing review. But yeah, interesting that that's been updated. The affordable homes are not affordable. This, I guess, what I'm reading from that is that we need to look again at how the affordable tenures that we fund and how we set rents. One of the key things in our affordability study for community-led housing is trying to focus in on affordable, on genuinely affordable homes. So this is what it costs as a proportion of people's incomes, and we seem to have moved. We've linked affordable housing costs to what the market can sustain, and in doing so, we've completely broken the link a broken link between kind of affordability and not affordable, and and then there's all other things which are really important, which is about how housing benefits paid. So when it goes direct to tenants, it can be then has to deal with the shortfall, whereas historically it might not have been. We did a lot of work in South Wales looking at how affordable housing was no longer affordable, and it was tenants that were kind of having to bear the shortfall. So there's some kind of key issues there. I don't know whether the Labour government has said it will look at the affordable rent tenure per se. Have they made any commitments at this stage? Maybe not. Maybe someone knows more than me about that, but I've certainly not seen any commitments like that. Local plans allocate areas for planning, handing value to landowners. Should plans be less prescriptive so there is less of a monopoly position? Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess the way that Labour look like they're dealing with that issue of handing value to landowners is to just acquire that land at closer to existing use value. That's the mechanism that's being proposed, rather than less prescriptive plans. The Competition and Markets Authority report earlier in the year, which looks at kind of how you increase supply through this market, is really clear that actually the planning system is far too uncertain, and there needs to deliver more certainty in order for house builders to build. So a less prescriptive approach might be challenging to that. Sarah's working with landowners who are looking to gift land for community-led housing, but there's still difficulties even though the planning inspector would sign off the scheme. Sometimes it's local planning departments not up to speed with recent national planning policy changes. Going to appeal is an added cost. Car usage is another issue. So yeah, I guess there's a point here about how on board the planners are with community-led housing, and how knowledgeable they are about current plan policy, and how much capacity they have to deal with all of the schemes that come to them. That's another point in the CMA's report earlier in the year, that the government should increase capacity within planning departments because it's taking too long. Someone's having to leave early for their cardio tennis lesson, which I'm quite jealous about. But yeah, thanks for that one. Did prefabs work? Any research? They were better than point block, etc. Yeah, I guess if we were to build prefabs nowadays, would it essentially be modular construction? So maybe they would be far better now, perform environmentally well, and have a longer lifespan. A collective custom build in York, looking at how they can use equity within the communities to cross-subsidise for affordable tenures, and look at housing densification. Yeah, so I mean, this has happened in quite a few schemes. There's a well-known scheme in Leeds, which is a mutual home ownership society, where there is a difference in the amount people are paying dependent on their incomes, and that provides a model to kind of make the finances stack up. So it's almost connected to what people earn, and that's a way to subsidise the development. Those mutual home ownership societies have not been adopted and created as quickly as we thought they might. There are good reasons for that. Brownfield sites can be excellent green parks. Much green belt is to keep nice views for the upper middle classes. So it says Tim from the Adam Smith Institute. Yeah, I think there is a task for an incoming Labour government, if it's elected, to clarify what it means by grey belt. It's probably going to need some very sophisticated tool for mapping and categorising these types of land to then justify development on them. That will be a difficult task, and it will not be without opposition. But then, how do we increase the supply without really taking on opposition at a local level? I think that's you cannot get to 300,000 homes a year without building in places that you're not previously developing. And I think that even with new settlements, I think that's going to be difficult. It's going to be political, kind of hot potato. I've suggested 400,000 car-free homes in the York area. Interesting that a lot of you, that's a kind of key concern. How are we planning these developments without cars? Yeah, I think the question is, does that hinder or help housing supply? I think a lot of private developers might want to build for car usage because the demand will be for it, is what they might think. But yeah, potentially radical idea. How about the creation of a national building corporation that will help build the homes and also train up the construction workers? Yeah, I mean, there's a thought experiment, which is, during the financial crisis, we nationalised certain banks because they were failing. They were due to fail, so we nationalised them. If there is ever the point in time where a volume house builder is in deep financial crisis, would we nationalise it? And then if we did nationalise it, what would we do with it after? Would we retain it, or would we? These are the things I think we should think about. I mean, it doesn't look like these are very profitable businesses at the minute, but yeah, preparing for that potential scenario. Is there commitment by Labour to control holiday homes like Berlin and Barcelona, with the chasm developed between rich and poor of the country? Yeah, I think there's various ways that this can be dealt with, charging kind of double council tax or whatever on homes that are second homes. I don't think that's politically too controversial. I think that would be one of the easier things to get through. It's disgusting that some communities in my county have hardly anybody living in one village, over 80% holiday homes. Yeah, same point about holiday homes. Listening to some of the comments, it really does come down to a postcode lottery. Needs to be central government policy that can support community-led housing schemes. A recent power in the National Planning Policy Framework is a step in the right direction, yeah. And there is also specific things in the NPPF about small sites. And I guess it's really, how do you kind of beef that up a little bit? It's essentially encouraging planning authorities to make sure there's small sites for SME developers and community-led housing. But it doesn't carry a really strong incentive. How do you beef up the incentives to make sure those sites come through? There's a link here to a Churchill Fellowship for some bedtime reading. That looks interesting. We Can Make in Bristol, who I know a little bit about, are delivering gentle densification. This is an organisation that's essentially parcelling off bits of people's gardens and then building homes within them and kind of slowly kind of densifying this one area in Bristol, using a kind of MMC, like a localised factory, using a community land trust model. I think it's really interesting. It's really interesting in the scope, obviously, for that to be replicated across different cities and towns. How do you replicate that? We Can Make will be the people to contact to find that out. Eddie's come back on the MMC houses in Birmingham. And he mentions also Sturchley Co-op, which is a really interesting scheme in Birmingham from a housing co-op who are, it's actually on the high street, and a community-led housing model is being used to not only create commercial units on the high street for local businesses, but to then add affordable units on top. And the plan, I think, Eddie, is that all of those units will be affordable. There's no market sale cross subsidy. So it's an interesting scheme worth looking at.
Yeah, they're all social rent. Yeah,
and really impressive, and worth pointing out that it was the beneficiary of the government community housing fund. It was a key part of them being able to do this, and that fund no longer exists. So doubling council tax is not the answer. Councils will be rubbing their hands. What about just saying no? So this is somebody's argument that you can't disincentivize second homes through taxation. You should basically deal with it at the point of sale. Is that the implication there? I think that's really difficult. How you deal with resales and prohibit them from becoming second homes. I'm not sure how you would do that. Do you have ideas? I'd be interested to hear. Is there anything that we've missed? I think we might have got to the end, Andy.
So, Tom, that's an incredible exercise in sustained concentration and just the breadth of your knowledge. The only thing that's disappointed us is you haven't explained to us what cardio tennis is, but we can maybe
well, I'm not the expert on that one, Andy.
But Tom, that's been phenomenal. So I said I was looking forward to it, and it's absolutely kind of met all my expectations, and we're all a lot more knowledgeable than we were an hour and a quarter ago. So but thanks very much to Tom, thanks very much to everybody who's given up some of the night tonight, and keep an eye on our website, because we've got more great in conversations coming up. So yeah, thanks Tom.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be with you. Thanks.